Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is financing solar projects for public and affordable housing. This webinar is a presentation of the Sustainable Solar Education Project, which is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance. And that project is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office. Our host for this webinar today is Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance. We also have with us two excellent guest speakers. But before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to expand or minimize the webinar console, you can use the little orange arrow circled here, or red arrow. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will save about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the webinar presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as time allows. We do expect to have a lot of people attending today's webinar, and that usually means a lot of questions. So to make sure that we get to your question, type it in as you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours with a link to the webinar materials, including the recording and the slides. And we will also be posting those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. This is a good link to know. We have a lot of other great webinars posted on that webpage, as well as upcoming webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate?
Thank you, Samantha. As Samantha said, today's webinar is on financing solar projects for public and affordable housing. But before we launch into the content, I just briefly want to tell you about who we are and why we're doing this webinar. So the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA for short, is a national nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. CESA is mostly made up of state-level agencies, and you can see our members on this slide. So this webinar is being conducted as part of our Sustainable Solar Education Project. That's a CESA-run project to help state and municipal officials ensure that distributed solar power remains consumer-friendly and benefits low and moderate income households. The project is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office. And through the project, we've developed a bunch of educational resources for state and municipal officials on topics related to solar consumer protection and solar equitability. So we've produced a series of 6 guides. You can actually see the guides on this slide. Solar information for consumers, publicly supported solar loan programs, standards and regulations for solar equipment installation and licensing and certification, solar plus storage for low and moderate income communities, bringing the benefits of solar to low income consumers, and consumer protection for community solar. We also do webinars like this one, and we produce a free monthly e-newsletter which covers project activities and resources and features and features news from around the country on solar equitability and consumer protection. And you can sign up for the newsletter through the link at the bottom of this screen. And then we also do some in-person workshops on the topics covered under the Sustainable Solar Education Project. And in fact, today's webinar is a product of one of the in-person workshops we conducted in October on solar for public and affordable housing in Denver, Colorado. We got some positive feedback, and some of the presentations from that workshop were particularly well received. And our webinar today is designed to help us reach a broader audience with the workshop content, and it features 2 speakers who presented at that in-person workshop. Later this month, we'll also be having another webinar focused on solar plus storage for public and affordable housing, which also grew out of the in-person workshop we did in October, and we'll tell you more about that at the end of this webinar. But for now, let's get into the content. We have two great speakers for today. I'll introduce them both now and then let them take it away. And as Samantha said, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. So our first presenter for today is Wayne Waite. Wayne is the principal of Waite Associates and currently provides public policy and technical support to environmental affordable housing advocacy organizations working to increase access to clean energy technologies in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Wayne previously worked as a regional energy and climate manager for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, vice president for public policy for Everyday Energy, and as director of public policy for the California Housing Partnership Corporation. And our second presenter will be Bracken Hendricks. As CEO and founder of Urban Ingenuity, Bracken oversees one of the nation's leading commercial PACE financing programs and manages efforts to finance and develop solar energy and microgrid projects with a special focus on community-based economic development that reaches underserved communities. Before launching Bracken was a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress, where he helped launch their energy practice and shaped clean energy portions of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as well as establishing the U.S. Department of Energy's Better Buildings Challenge. Together with the Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, Bracken co-authored the book Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy, and he served as a longtime advisor to former President Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation on Job Creation, Energy Innovation, and Resilient Urban Development. Bracken holds a master's degree in public policy and urban planning from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over to Wayne. Wayne, the platform's yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to click on the slide there. I guess to begin, I think it's important to note that we're no longer in the phase of early adopters with respect to multifamily solar. Bloomberg's Energy Outlook for 2017 expects energy investments in renewables to grow by 2 to 3% per year and project 50 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2020. To put this in context with a baseball analogy, we're in the top of the third inning of innovative solar financing. We have 1 million U.S. homes that have adopted solar. We have a potential market of another 60 million buildings. And to reach this market, we're likely to see a lot of innovative energy financing projects in the future. Today, we're going to be examining solar financing pathways suited to affordable housing. And we're also going to be hopefully looking at some of the underlying risks that need to be managed by property owners in this process. To kind of help frame this, I think it's important to review the 4 big dependencies driving solar economics and financing. The first 2 on the list, the ITC and solar PV costs, most of you are well familiar with, and I think the key issue I think for us these days is whether the new tax legislation and the new solar tariffs are going to kind of affect the markets in some way. Our sense, in kind of looking at the research, is that the effects are going to be probably minimal at best. I think the renewable investment ITC is going to be continually competitive in tax credit markets, and the estimate of the solar tariff effects are maybe 3 to 5% in added short-term costs, which equate to about $100 to maybe $135 per kW. With respect to the other 2, the solar valuation and utility tariffs, folks tend to be kind of not as familiar with the effects of these elements in project economics. But it's important to note that solar value and tariffs are core dependencies because the cash flow of these projects is fundamental to a project's feasibility. And solar works within multifamily markets really because of the peak period pricing, the compensation values provided under NEM. However, in 2017, there were 66 rate cases in 31 states that provided proposed revisions to solar value and NEM rules, which is just kind of an important issue. Additionally, high tariffs in states like California, and there are probably a dozen other states where the utility rates are high enough to kind of move solar well. Those rate structures are now shifting from kind of midday peaks to later evening peaks. There's movement on demand charges in some markets, added fees being added. And in 2017, there were 84 cases in 35 states that requested increases in fixed utility charges by at least 10%. So these factors play into the solar financing fairly significantly. To kind of put these in perspectives, these dependencies in perspectives, I want to kind of make a couple points. First, this chart is for some research that has been done by the Energy Institute at Haas at UC Berkeley. And what this chart shows is, with the blue line, is the relative significance of the NEM incentives in the kind of their role in overall solar financing. And basically it's on par with the ITCs. And these are NEM values for the exported energy. And it's the value of that exported energy above the really the averaged utility price. So this NEM value for this peak pricing represents a really significant input into that equation. Additionally, on the chart, kind of shown by the orange line, is the role of accelerated depreciation. And accelerated depreciation for PPAs or power purchase agreements contribute about 12 to 15% of that value, which is fairly significant, but it's also a factor that is likely to be affected by the new tax rates in the tax legislation. And then kind of lastly, the red dotted line shows the role of utility solar rebates. And as you can see, it has kind of a declining role and importance, I think, in the overall transactions. A second perspective, I think, that I think is important is that there has been a trend, I think, largely driven by the declining solar cost, in the movement from power purchase agreements to property owner purchasing of these systems. And furthermore, that movement is also aided by the valuation. Cash purchases or ownership of these systems or financing generally lead to higher overall financing value of these systems, which is attractive, I think, to property owners, and I think important to kind of long-term project stability. Kind of moving on to for the near term, the financing pathways that are going to be dominant within affordable housing, I think, are very similar to what we saw probably back as far as 2008. That is, power purchase agreements and kind of ownership structures largely driven by the low-income housing tax credit program. So for existing buildings, the third-party ownership using PPAs in California has accounted for really a majority of the solar transactions on existing buildings. Of the 600 projects in the multifamily affordable solar housing program in California, about 70% of those were moved forward using power purchase agreements. Conversely, for new affordable housing new construction rehabilitation, ownership of the PV system is a fairly clear preference. And of the 100 affordable housing projects in the new solar Homes Partnership Program in California, over 90% of those properties owned and sought to own the system. And that movement has been really facilitated by state housing finance agencies. There are 23 state housing finance agencies today that have preferences for advancing solar. And those preferences I think are fairly significant in growing this market. So each of these approaches have pros and cons. Clearly under the low-income housing tax credit, there's high leverage of other funding resources that are in play that leads to being able to kind of reach tenant units and producing generally higher savings values, which I think reduce kind of long-term pricing risk on the property. PPAs, on the other hand, because they're no upfront cost and turnkey type of models, tend to be a really kind of go-to preference for a lot of properties. And each of these approaches also has some cons. There's some transaction complexities with respect to the LIHTC initiatives under 4% tax credit projects. There's also a question that comes into play about really how much of that ITC value can be actually captured, and value engineering on these projects tends to be a real threat. For PPAs, again, you have only marginal cost price gains. You have escalator issues, and there's some kind of transparency questions. So kind of looking at these two approaches in terms of their relative financial resiliency, the chart provides a comparison of the cost coverage from common area energy savings, and as possibly a proxy on the kind of relative resiliencies of these strategies to changes in tariffs and solar compensation levels, as well as a proxy for determining kind of what financing gap might need to be addressed in kind of serving these markets. So as we compared these, we tried to do it in kind of on a level playing field. For the LIHTC, we were factoring in the ITC as well as the housing tax credits and O&M cost, and trying to kind of discern really what the cash returns are. There was no accelerated depreciation values included in that, and clearly on the LIHTC outcomes shown in the blue and greenish bars, they demonstrate increasing savings and have some clear cost hedge advantages related to the ownership of the system. For PPAs, we also included the ITC. We included accelerated depreciation benefits. We also included an ITC adder for development fees, and there was no O&M costs associated with those transactions. And the lower returns in this case are clearly driven by the tenant solar costs that are kind of part of this modeling that aren't kind of recaptured, and the PPA cost escalators, which in the analysis was assumed to be 2%. Now, if we add and factor in utility allowance adjustments on the tenant side, the dotted lines in blue there show that certainly the value increases, and it emphasizes the relative importance of UAs in kind of reaching this market. In terms of emergence approaches, PACE is clearly an important concept, and Bracken's going to kind of delve into that. But it really shows that there's a lot of added value to be gained if the properties are putting some skin into this financing kind of equation. The other two, one is a master service kind of a blocker corporation model. It's a very intense structural strategy where the property owner is looking across a portfolio and looking to develop and manage the solar assets to optimize and really safeguard or protect, control the returns to the organization. And then secondly, the community solar model, which is really kind of a marketing strategy which leverages the ability to kind of aggregate subscriber markets to facilitate community solar development. So kind of quickly looking at the Blocker Corporation, the Blocker Corporations have been used in California by the Santa Barbara County Housing Authority, by the California Rural Communities Development Corporation, and there's some other housing organizations that have experimented with that. Basically, what occurs under the structure is that the housing organization creates a captive LLC to create and develop and manage the solar assets. The agency, housing agency, makes contributions through loans, through grants, through incentives that are provided for solar, and contributes their developer fees to kind of facilitate the financing of that project. The Blocker Corporation also allows for the ITC to be leveraged. And so the captive LLC and the housing organization set up a PPA to set stable electricity prices across the housing portfolio. That PPA rate is certainly below the utility rates. The revenues that are generated from the properties back to the LLC are used to offset and cover that debt coverage. And any residual receipts are kind of filtered back into the organization for the benefit of the organization and housing needs. So it's kind of like a closed circle. And in this particular case, the Santa Barbara Housing Authority was able to kind of reach tenants. They used the public housing energy performance contracting was an input into this, and under the UA rules, they were able to kind of reach tenants and kind of make UA adjustments there. For other multifamily properties unable to do that, the focus has been on really portfolio-wide common area investments. The second approach, community solar, there are a lot of versions of that. The public housing authorities in Colorado and Minnesota are really national leaders, I think, in this space. In 2017, there were 21 states that took actions on community solar. And so multifamily is a very attractive asset in terms of community solar because of the ability to kind of aggregate off-takers. So under this model, typically, and the model that I'm going to describe, the partnership occurs between the property owner and the solar developer. The property owner's role in this is really to aggregate the off-takers and assume the obligations for purchasing the power on behalf of tenants. This achieves economies of scale and the cash flow to secure the financial commitments to develop the community solar. And it's really beneficial, I think, to the solar developer. So, and because the property is assuming risk, we can assume that there's some value that is provided to the property owner as part of this transaction through the PPA rate. The agreement that occurs, an important note here, this is an area where you're likely to need approval by HUD or the funding agency to kind of move forward with kind of a long-term agreement. And on this point, I would just say that there is certainly a lot of precedent for HUD approving these long-term agreements. I've heard recently that there's some questions about these, and again, I think the guidance is pretty clear that HUD has the ability to approve these, and kind of we look forward to them and kind of working through whatever issues they might currently have with this. But assuming that the PPA agreement is approved under the PPA, all the generation is exported to the grid. The customers at the multifamily site receive a solar credit on their utility bill. So the tenants are benefiting at this point. But the real key to success is really how the tenant cost recovery occurs. To make these transactions work, the tenants need to contribute some portion of the credits that they're receiving to facilitate the financing of the projects. And One of the mechanisms that is looked at, again, is utility allowances. And here, I think the important theory, utility allowance theory, that might make this work well is to kind of look at the solar credits as kind of a sub-metering type of model, much like under kind of traditional sub-metering, where the property owner is paying for the electricity and sub-metering the cost to the tenants. Here we would have the credits that are being provided to the tenant household sub-metered. The cost of those credits could not exceed the value of the tenant's solar compensation of the credit, but assuming that credit or some value from that credit can be obtained, it provides kind of a workable case to finance these projects. Given the importance of utility allowances kind of in this equation, the final two slides here, I want to address that a little bit. There's a lot of experience, in a sense, in California on this point. Here's an example of a 72-unit property in Northern California, where the differential between the pre-solar and the post-solar electricity cost was about $37. Assuming the $30 on average is captured by way of a utility allowance adjustment, that could potentially leverage just over $250,000 in kind of added financing for the projects. To put that in another perspective, assuming a $3.50 a watt installed watt cost for the solar system at 1.6 kW per unit, you're covering about 60% of those tenant solar costs. So it represents a fairly big cash flow monster and opportunity, and it's not surprising that property owners kind of want to look at this. The questions for me is utility allowance really a thing, and something that can be kind of relied on in the context of these transactions? And I think the evidence is a bit mixed, and it's kind of easier said than done. For LIHTC, for energy performance contracts, which is public housing, tenant vouchers, I think that there's some clear pathways for feasibility. Where it becomes more problematic is for multifamily HUD-assisted properties, which is project-based rental assistance. And utility allowance adjustments cannot be really reasonably relied on in that context, given the policy guidance that HUD has issued. There's also some other concerns and issues that I think are important to kind of point out to the group here. First off, many of these solar transactions are heavily subsidized, and so when you're taking away benefits from the tenants, there's obviously some big energy equity concerns that have to be kind of weighed as part of that. Secondly, there are also transactional complexities. There are a number of things that really affect the value, the amount of a utility allowance adjustment that can be kind of detrimental, both to project financing, but also detrimental to the tenant. And so these processes really require kind of specialized analysis, approval and notifications, and some verification and updating that you don't typically see in these types of processes. We also need federal leadership to kind of resolve some of the inconsistencies around utility allowances and really get some guidance in place that facilitates market-based solutions. With respect to the sub-metering I mentioned before, there's really no direct guidance on sub-metering solar credits. There's nothing directly on point. And so some guidance addressing some tenant protection issues is also needed. And in the process, it might be useful to consider other alternatives. And on-bill payment, which is kind of very similar to on-bill financing type of models, might represent a useful avenue, I think, for this market. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and if we have time at the end, we can take up some of the very specific risk management issues that are germane to all types of financing. Thanks a lot, and turning it over to Bracken.
Thanks, Wayne. Bracken, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Yep, thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is Bracken Hendricks. I'm the CEO of Urban Ingenuity. We are a company based in Washington, D.C., and we do work nationally, specifically in the space of clean energy deployment as a tool for economic development with a special focus on low-income communities and affordable housing. In addition, we administer the Washington, D.C. Property Assessed Clean Energy, or PACE, financing program. And in the context of the District of Columbia, we've done a number of kind of first projects of seeking different types of approval to do the kind of integration of affordable housing project finance with clean energy using PACE and various other tools. And I'll get into that in a moment. I'm not speaking on behalf of the District of Columbia here in any way, but I am speaking as an administrator of a PACE program and on behalf of Urban Ingenuity. Also want to just really quickly thank NAID and Clean Energy States Alliance. The ability to bring together energy, housing, state and local partners is exceptional in this. So we were very excited to speak to the audience and glad to redo what Wayne and I had spoken together in Denver a few months back, and his presentation really kind of drills down on the nature of the market, the tools for doing these projects. What my objective now is to drill down on a couple specific project structures and really show you how these things come together in a use case. So I'm going to, once I get control here of the, it's taking a moment, just give me 1 second. There we go. First of all, just want to kind of talk about the challenge to doing solar as a nonprofit affordable housing developer or an owner or property manager of affordable housing, whether you're, and then this would include public housing authorities and others. There is a specific challenge that a lot of the resources that are out there that Wayne was just talking about monetizing are federal investment tax credits or various forms of depreciation that assume you have a tax appetite. So if you're a nonprofit or a public entity, that actually can deprive the project of, a very significant piece of the return. So figuring out how to monetize those benefits is one reason why people often lean towards a pure PPA structure where you bring in an external investor to get those benefits. What he was showing with connecting 4% or 9% low-income housing tax credits to solar projects is a very clear benefit. You're bringing in a third-party investor who can monetize it, pay for it. That's a really critical piece here. Another issue that is often a challenge in the affordable sector is that you see a lot of small rooftops, 20, 50, 80 kW system sizes, or roofs that have other uses with various HVAC mechanical systems going on there. Figuring out how to take small projects and make them economical is challenging, or how to aggregate multiple small rooftops, even if they're under one developer's ownership, they may be each under a separate special purpose entity. So the aggregation can be challenging. And then, of course, in those ownership structures, it's often bankruptcy remote entities. You may have low-income housing tax credit investors, other third parties. You may have a housing authority with a land lease. There's a lot of people with claims to the property. So the ownership structure can be an inhibitor. And frankly, anything that creates risk is going to discourage moving forward with the project. And even the perception that things are slow can discourage either the property owner or the investors from advancing these projects. Often you see the PPA providers, the power purchase agreement investors, very comfortable with doing a 5 megawatt investment for an IKEA, but maybe not so much for a nonprofit developer, a community-based organization, these sorts of things. So the cash flows, the credit quality, understanding the risk can be challenging. And then Wayne was just talking about the utility allowances, which if it's all tenant metered space, which is a real trend, and if you lower the utilities, all you're going to do is increase the contract rent, you can really create misaligned incentives. So there's a number of structural reasons why uptake hasn't been faster than it is, than it potentially could be in the affordable space. But we see at Urban Ingenuity a lot of really strong opportunities to kind of come in and refocus along the lines of what Clean Energy States Alliance and Wayne and others are kind of looking at. We see a really emergent opportunity to understand affordable housing and solar, the aggregation across, figuring out mechanisms to pool. We think that they're very much there to turn a lot of small projects into one big clean investment for a tax equity investor. Also, in this sort of aggregator middleware space, to think about how you standardize and streamline contract structures, origination, the various forms of documentation that are needed for the IRS. One thing is housers are exceptional asset managers. They're used to this work of maintaining long-term, high-quality performance of a physical asset in the built environment on behalf of third-party investors. So really figuring out how to harness the intrinsic strength of the affordable housing community to bring in solar as a new form of asset that is a logical add-on to these housing units, and community solar in particular, that is driving not only green benefits, but strong community benefits for tenants, for vulnerable populations in the communities that we have a mission to serve. We're also expert at doing creative structuring of bringing together debt and multiple forms of equity, multiple forms of incentive, federal, state, and local forms of financing and rebates, and bringing together these complicated capital stacks. Often that's seen as a barrier that these are very complicated projects, but they're also, it's a wealth of expertise. And lastly, there are a range of things. I noticed registrants from various forms of green banks, from various energy agencies. In the energy space, increasingly, I think the community is moving from direct subsidy to leverage of private capital. And we need to think very broadly and dynamically about the types of credit enhancements that may already exist in community development, housing finance, and green project development, to really think about how to de-risk this sector to bring greater benefits to low-income communities and greater deployment to the preservation of the climate. So the first case study I want to kind of walk you through is an example that we're building. It's a national platform that we're establishing now in real time with the National Housing Trust, a nonprofit, CDFI, and NHT are very active nationally in structuring and funding and financing affordable housing. It's their mission. They partnered with enterprise community partners to do debt facilities through a joint venture called NHT Enterprise. And we've joined with them to create an entity called NHT Ingenuity Power, which is a platform that's trying to do a kind of a hybrid in between some of the things Wayne was just talking about. How do you take the benefits of a power purchase agreement and the benefits of direct ownership? How do you structure these tax equity financed solar deals in a way that is familiar and logical and that really works for housers? We're doing it, we have a real blessing that the District of Columbia is a very, very proactive and progressive jurisdiction. And you see there the photograph is our mayor at the signing of our district-wide climate plan. We're also pleased to join with the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're not a state currently, but we hope to be one, and we have a lot of the infrastructure of a state with state energy office, state regulatory mechanisms for energy. So we can do a lot of the things that state programs do. So we have a very strong rebate program and a pilot innovation initiative called Solar for All. So we're working with NHT to really launch this, co-developing over 3 megawatts of solar across the district, and we're giving away a megawatt of that energy directly to provide low-income benefits to income-qualified, very low-income folks in subsidized and LIHTC housing. Our goal is to cut utility bills with that megawatt 50% for over 400 homes, and then also to build the scalable platform. And with NHT, we're working in California, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, a number of places around the country already. So this example that we're talking about here is something that we do feel is scalable nationally, and would love to explore opportunities with folks. So this is just a quick snapshot of the pool. It's entirely affordable multifamily housing. It's all owned by both a mix of nonprofit, predominantly nonprofit, but also some for-profit affordable housing developers. 5 developers plus NHT. System size is somewhere between 3 and 3.5 megawatts. This is all located in Washington, D.C. A single policy environment is very important for financing these projects. But what we're really doing is we're trying to unlock this challenge of taking a lot of little buildings. So it's 3 megawatts, but it's across 50 plus buildings. And we're structuring sort of a 50% savings built in and then this free energy as well. So we are building a capital stack, bringing together tax equity, sponsor equity as a commitment either from the houser or from our platform, and then various forms of traditional debt and grant funds to pull together a capital stack to build these funds, to build these projects. And Wayne was talking about in his Blocker Corporation example, that's exactly what we're talking about here. So we have the ability to build a Blocker Corporation with each houser. So you're a nonprofit housing developer number 1, you build nonprofit housing developer solar funds number 1. You own it. You own this asset, you have this for-profit Blocker Corporation that owns alongside a tax equity investor. And lo and behold, it looks a lot like a low-income housing tax credit deal. So when we present this as a LIHTC financing, the bells go off. It's a lot easier to get board approval. The complexity there, though, is you have to build a new SPE, you have to build a new capital stack every time. So the innovation we're doing now under our current grant program in the district and scaling nationally is really building a pooled Blocker Corporation, but making it very transparent so that we can actually own these assets with this sort of public purpose, special purpose entity, and then pass back the benefits. This is an example that NHT has actually already completed a project, a couple megawatts with the Denver Public Housing Authority, and they're creating direct benefits back to the tenants, and they can be in the form of lower energy prices, but that does get confusing on utility costs. So there's other ways to pass benefits back through. It can be supportive services. It can be simple things like metro benefits, transit funds, or other forms, ways of passing, functionally increased purchasing power back to low-income folks. So when we put this all together, this is a snapshot of the benefits that can flow from this pooled free megawatt of power and the 3+ megawatts of total deployment. If there's zero investment because it is this sort of third-party structure. It's all invested through these various layers of debt and equity that are being created. So the housers can just get access to the solar. And because of the third-party ownership, it's not complicating to their existing capital stack and ownership. We need approval from the LIHTC partners, the various syndicators, others who may have a stake in the deal, but we're not complicating the ownership, nor are we taxing their capital investment. We are creating essentially development fees, and they can flow in the form of lease payments. Rental income is very familiar for housers to receive that sort of income, so they're just getting a new source of rental income from the roof. Or you can create other forms of asset management fees and various things that are sort of commonly part of the pro forma, the operating budget for these operating entities that are managing public and affordable housing. So, $1 million worth of benefits flowing back into the houser itself for consenting to host this project. But the benefits don't stop at the houser's level. That's the incentive for them to join the program. We're also passing back over $5 million of benefits back to the tenant in the form of reduced utility bills or other forms of direct tenant benefits that are captured by the low-income constituency that there's a mission commitment to serve, but also significant reduced property-level energy bills in the form of payments for common area metered energy for security lighting or for master metered services. So by harnessing aggregation to get the economies of scale, bringing together the creative financing approach, but not resting it on the shoulders of each project so that you have to start again at the ground, but rather trying to build a facility that can replicate that form of structuring so we can deploy these creatively sourced resources. We're actually driving more affordability at the tenant level, but also more affordability at the pooled institutional level. So we're making it easier for these community-based entities to thrive and do their mission-related work, and also increase their overall resilience, whether it's climate resilience or financial resilience to rising utility costs. I want to pivot now into a second example of a structure that's that is readily available to many housers around the country. And this is not uniform. PACE, or Property Assessed Clean Energy, is a tax-based financing structure. It's in 33 states plus the district. I mentioned we manage the district program, but in about 80% of the U.S. population is in a PACE-enabled jurisdiction. This is just a map of what it is, because it sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple. This is showing the district's version, but it's roughly equivalent state by state or municipality by municipality. PACE ultimately rests on the taxing authority of a local government. So the local government, or through the state tax code, but implemented through localities in commercial real estate taxes, which would cover all multifamily housing over 5 units, you basically take on a voluntary tax payment. At the property level, it's recorded in the land records. There's a couple different ways. It can vary depending on the tax law of the state and the enforcement mechanisms for the locality. But in the district's case, you consent to a semi-annual tax payment. You put a special assessment, which is recorded in the land record. And then the district, the local government, the taxing entity, creates a note or another form of acknowledgement or a bond that is then offered to a private capital provider. So the public entity, all they're doing is offering their collection security mechanism to secure capital. And then private capital is flowing in, generally at no cost or no general obligation liability to the jurisdiction. So it's a really nice public-private blend of private capital, public authority. And it's one reason why we think it's really going to continue to grow. It's had a great track record both in very blue and very red states. So, Texas is an extremely vibrant program. And in that case, it's smart government, small government, private capital, public, P3 partnership. So the private capital flows into the property owner. They put the money into the project. The project starts yielding savings. They now have spent $0 out of pocket. So it's 100% financing. They get the energy savings on day one with no money out of pocket, and they simply consent to take on a new operating cost. So it's not a capital budget line item, and this is going to be really important. I think Wayne mentioned the notion of value engineering earlier on. Often what we see, especially in capital constrained projects, is folks don't want to spend, they don't have the money to build the building they want. So they end up having to cut back. I'm $1 million short. I'm going to have to cut $1 million out of my capital costs. I just do. So solar, even if it yields long-term cash flows, it goes because it's not essential. So that 100% financing is critical. The cash flow positive, because the debt flows in the form of an operating expense of a tax bill, means that when you get those savings with no money out of pocket, it shows up after you paid your debt service as just fresh new operating income. If your savings are greater than your annual expense, you've actually improved the cash flow in the property without spending money. And because it's an operating expense, generally it can be treated as an off-balance sheet commitment. I said debt, but it's a little bit debt, it's a little bit equity. It's new money flowing in, secured over the life of the project, and it never accelerates. So because of that, we've seen many projects where the accounting treatment is, wait a minute, this is a tax bill. Yes, it's a long-term obligation. Yes, it amortizes over time, but it doesn't accelerate. It can never come due. So it's really different from a mortgage. So I'm going to walk you through an example here of a large, complex gut rehab. These are based on real financials, slightly generalized from a real project that we looked at and underwrote. It's a 4% LIHTC financing. Tax equity sort of disappeared because you may have noticed there was a new tax bill recently passed, and corporate liabilities for, their tax liabilities are shrinking, and the tax equity market has at very least had a lot of disruption. But there are, and then there's just pressure for subsidies, preservation trust funds, various things. So the emergence of these capital gaps is really creating a pressure for folks to really cut back and value engineer. So this is a project that we're really excited by because it brings together a very, very large maximized solar PV with a community solar structure for billing to realize the benefits, to capture benefits that flow to tenants, but to create benefits for the whole project, to integrate battery storage. On this design, we actually ended up putting in about 600 kW of storage and a very deep ability to finance other green building energy conservation measures, and also to look at tax-exempt financing. And that's an innovation. In the District of Columbia, we did the first low-income housing tax credit project that was closed with PACE. It was a 9% deal. We went through all of the HUD approvals, and HUD started very skeptical. And then they ended by saying, we really like this. We could do this on a repeatable basis in our mixed finance and publicly subsidized programs. We went through the Office of Public and Indian Housing for that approval. We also did the first tax-exempt funded deal. We funded that 30-year money in the 3% range. And we're working now with our housing finance agency to develop a long-term structure that's marrying housing bonds and PACE bonds, and you can stay tuned for more announcements about that. But this is a project, it's very common sources and uses, right? $52 million acquisition, gut rehab, vacant property, basically needs to be stripped down to the bones and then rebuilt. And lo and behold, they've got $50 million of available funds after they put everything together with tax equity, with a mortgage, bond tax-exempt housing bond funded mortgage and various forms of subsidy. So they're kind of stuck. So they can either do nothing and it stalls, which this project did for quite a while. They can put in a lot of their own money, but that means they're going to do fewer projects and preserve fewer units. Or they can say, well, I could probably squeeze $2 million out of here. I wanted the LEED gold, but I'm not gonna. I wanted to do the super efficient boiler and solar and the triple glazed windows, and I'm going to put in the cheapest first cost boiler, the cheapest first cost windows, and the solar's gone. So that value engineering strategy is something that we very commonly see. Or what we've developed in the district, and we're really working on scaling this nationally as Urban Ingenuity, is to bring together the tax-exempt capital market for nonprofit property owners and affordable housing to make low-cost funds available for these public interested PACE projects. So if you think about what we're doing, we got a $2 million gap, but what we said here was, yeah, you may not, in the original plan, they had no solar whatsoever. So we looked at, and this is different, the solar project I described is actually larger with the storage, but if, at a minimum, it would be very logical to put $1 million worth of solar and it would throw off net cash, which would actually increase the gap to $3 million. So it's never going to go anywhere under standard project finance structure. But if you look over the life cycle of the project, those $3 million of green investments in boiler, windows, HVAC writ large, more insulation, and then the new infusion of solar, you can very conservatively estimate the utility savings, reduced operation and maintenance, and new cash flows from the solar. You get a $310,000 annual new cash flow. But you actually have to cover some debt service for that $3 million. So if you're paying for this, we structured it as a PACE note in this design and these financials. So you end up, you have to pay an annual debt service, but you're realizing net cash flow gains. So you're $70,000 in the first year and every year thereafter in the positive. So this is a very sensible project to move forward with now when we bring it in under PACE financing. So you have this $2 million gap, and you'll notice that the LIHTC contribution is $22 million. That's the tax credit investment under LIHTC. Interestingly, if you do it with PACE, the PACE improvements of the extra $3 million is actually going to bring in additional basis into your tax credit calculation. So you're almost double dipping, right? You're getting the benefits of various forms of tax credits on the solar side, but you're actually adding to the capital basis of the project. And that does improve your LIHTC contributions from your LIHTC investor. Excuse me. I'm fighting a cold here, so I get a little froggy. So that's really the takeaway here is the bottom line. You bring in $1 million of solar, increase your overall capital need, but you also bring in an additional essentially $3 million of sources, and you can actually reduce the PACE amount because you bring in more equity. So it's just beneficial all around. And you've got a more valuable project because it has new cash flows that you otherwise couldn't access. And this is just showing if the entity had said, well, I like this deal, maybe I'll just put up more of my own money and pay for it out of equity. A logical thing to do, but the reality is people generally don't. It's expensive in a few different ways. If I'm trying to build affordable housing units, that's $3 million I'm not spending on new affordable housing. But if you also look at it in a pure cash flow basis, if you spend that money, the $3 million out of pocket, annually you're getting $310,000, but in year one you're in the negative substantially. And while you get this concurrent, consistent stream of benefits, it takes you a long time to pay yourself off. And this is why people often do a life cycle cost analysis or a payback period evaluation. It's not a very good use of $3 million if it's not my mission to build green projects or solar. Negative IRR, very low, over 5 years is negative, it's very low, even over 10 years. If you think about not spending your own money, but getting $70,000 at first year and every year thereafter, you're cash flow positive from a net present value perspective every single year. So it's really hard to argue with not doing the project under this PACE financing if you bring it in the core entirely external third-party finance. And the internal rate of return is infinite because you're basically getting return without spending money. So it's a nice structure. So we think that, none of these are silver bullets. What we're doing in DC with marrying PACE to housing bonds is something that we've gotten comfortable with legally with our bond counsel, with the various folks. Some states, the housing finance agencies aren't there yet. I'm optimistic that it'll become common practice widely. There's also some issues. This works very, very well with FHA funding because HUD has really gotten their head around it. Freddie Mac is very interested and really creatively engaged in exploring it. Fannie Mae has some issues on the single family side. FHA, there was a recent announcement. FHA has some trouble with PACE as a single family financing, but commercial PACE, C-PACE or PACE for multifamily residential is quite different. So it's a little more difficult if you've got a Fannie Mae loan in your debt stack. So PACE may not fit everywhere. In those examples where it doesn't and you can't bring it into the ownership of the entity, this hybrid PPA or blocker corporation structure that we're developing with the National Housing Trust is another great way to just immediately create cash flows back at the project level, at the tenant level, with no outlay of capital. Yeah, there you go. And I guess I'm giving you my cell phone into a web-based, long-dated, so it shows how interested and committed I am to this body of work. So call me anytime. So I will kick it back over to Sam, to Nate, and we can go forward.
Yeah, thanks much, Bracken, and thanks to you too, Wayne. There's a lot in those presentations, and we're we're already close to the hour mark. So we'll do just a couple of questions, but before we do, we're going to bleed over the hour mark a little bit, and so those who have to hop off can do so, but we'll keep going for another few minutes, in part because we have received a bunch of questions on some of the risks, the regulatory risk issues, and what the protection mechanisms might be for those that Wayne mentioned. And so I know he has got some slides in the queue. If you want to just take a couple of minutes to run through those, Wayne, that would be great. In particular, one of the questions, we asked, what are some of the risks issues? What are the key drivers causing net energy metering policy to be in flux? Fundamental gaps in policy that has led to the current instability.
Yeah, and we don't have to address those with slides. With respect to, I guess, the risks associated with net metering, it kind of relates to when power is supplied on the grid, and really what the kind of marginal costs are associated with the power. And what we're finding in California is as solar was being developed, it was being compensated at a fairly high peak rate during midday, but in midday there is now a large supply of electricity generated from PV systems, and what has kind of emerged in California, and I think is a model that other states are looking at, is that they're moving those peak periods to and peak pricing to periods where solar is really not generating power, and what that means is that the value of solar now during the day is devalued, that it has a kind of a lower compensation rate. And then further, that the power that we're paying for the electricity that we're using when solar is not being used is higher, much higher. And there are many issues, I think, with respect to low-income tenants in that regard, because tenants do not have the ability, really, low-income tenants do not have the ability to shift demand as readily to kind of non-peak periods. So you have these kind of cost dynamics in place that kind of affect the long-term value for these projects. So kind of looking beyond the first year of financing, you're looking at really the factors that affect value. And what that ultimately leads to, I think, and what certainly a lot of the research is certainly pointing to, and a lot of the people with the industry is pointing to, is that we need more integrated investments. We need to look at not only a standalone solar PV system for long-term value, but we need to think about storage. We certainly need to think about energy efficiency strategies that allow property owners and tenants to kind of shift demand. And maybe I'll stop there, Nate.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Appreciate it. I'll ask just one or two more questions here, since we are over the mark. But here's a question for you, Bracken. Does the PACE transaction work for residents serving solar, or only for the owner-paid common areas? Can you clarify that?
So the real question on the billing and metering structure, and it also applies to sort of utility allowance calculations, you do have to develop mechanisms to recapture the funds. So if we talked about those payback periods, if you simply pass the benefits through to tenants, you do have to be creative in terms of figuring out how to make sure that the savings are available. So one thing that we've done is to really understand the rate structures, the billing structures. In one property, we ended up keeping owner-paid utilities for all of their Section 8 voucher units. So it was a couple hundred units. They had maybe 80 units of Section 8 vouchers. They paid for them at the owner level in addition to the common area. And we basically sized it so those two pools were enough where we basically channeled 100% of the energy to offset that load and then build it at the utility rate. That recoups the debt service and it brings the green into the project. Another thing that is a very, very good structure is community solar. So if you are passing the savings through, but you can bill through a community solar program, you can actually have the tenants pay a solar electric bill at the unit level and have those funds flow back in to pay for the solar. So that's a structure that works exceedingly well. Community solar is a very powerful tool.
Great, thanks. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to call it there. I know I have to run myself. So please we've got great questions. Thanks for all these good questions. We can take them offline with the presenters directly, and they provided contact information. So reach out to them with your questions. I want to thank our panelists again, Wayne and Bracken, for your excellent and meaty presentations. And I also want to thank everyone for tuning in and for all the good questions you did ask. I want to turn it back over to Samantha briefly just to tell you about some of the upcoming Sustainable Solar Education Project webinars we've got, including one focused on public and affordable housing, and then just to close out. So thanks again. Over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks, Nate. So as Nate said, on your screen right now, you can see info about a couple of upcoming webinars that we have that may interest you if today's webinar topic was of interest. Those webinars are on Thursday, February 22nd and on March 1st. So you can find more info about those webinars at csed.org/webinars. And we hope to see you there. Thanks for joining us for this one. Bye.